The scent of old paper and roasted coffee beans was the only perfume Ophelia Vance ever needed, a stark contrast to the expensive, suffocating fragrances of the world she secretly ruled. She sat in her favorite corner of the Dusty Page, a small, tucked-away bookstore in Beacon Hill that seemed to exist out of time. Outside, the late November wind stripped the final copper leaves from the trees, rattling the window panes. But inside, the air was still and warm. Ophelia took a slow sip of her black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and turned the page of her book, feeling the rough texture of the paper under her fingertips. Across the small, scarred wooden table, Arthur Sterling watched her with a look that was equal parts adoration and anxiety. He was dressed in his usual vintage tweed jacket, the elbows slightly worn, a garment that spoke of old money that didn't feel the need to shout. He loved this version of her, the woman in the soft, non-branded gray cardigan who could lose herself in a philosophy text for hours. He didn't know the other version. He didn't know that the woman sipping a $3 coffee could buy the entire block without checking her bank balance. To Arthur, she was just Ophelia, a retired librarian with a gentle soul and a quiet life. "You're staring again, Arthur," Ophelia murmured without looking up, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm just memorizing the piece," Arthur replied, his voice soft. "Before the storm rolls in." As if on cue, the silence was shattered by the shrill ring of his cell phone. Arthur flinched. He pulled the device from his pocket, glancing at the screen. The color drained from his face. "Mother," he whispered. He answered, his posture instantly stiffening, his voice pitching up into a polite, guarded tone that Ophelia had learned to recognize as his defense mechanism. "Yes, Mother." "Yes, I received it." "No, I haven't asked her yet." "Mother, please." He hung up a moment later, looking 10 years older. With a trembling hand, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed it on the table between them. It was heavy, embossed with a silver crest that caught the dim light of the bookstore lamp. The wedding of Tiffany Sterling and David Thorne. "You don't have to go," Arthur said quickly, his hand hovering over the invitation as if he wanted to snatch it back. "I can make an excuse. I can say you're ill. Or that we're traveling." Ophelia closed her book gently. "Arthur, why are you so afraid? It is just a wedding." "It's not just a wedding, Ophelia. It's a tribunal," he said, his eyes pleading. "My family, they have a way of looking at people. The Sterling Standard, my mother calls it. If you don't wear the right pearls, if you don't speak with the right accent, if you don't come from the right lineage, they don't just ignore you. They dissect you." He reached out and took her hand, his skin cool against hers. "I'm not ashamed of you. Never that. I'm trying to protect you from their polite cruelty. I don't want to see you hurt." Ophelia looked at the man she loved. She saw his fear, but she also saw his kindness. He was willing to hide her away not because he was embarrassed, but because he treasured her. She turned her hand over and squeezed his fingers, grounding him. "I have faced boardroom sharks and market crashes, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and steady, though he missed the double meaning. "I think I can handle a few snobbish comments over cocktails. I will go with you." Arthur let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. He nodded, though the worry didn't leave his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. "But just be prepared. The dress code is strictly black tie, and my mother will be watching everything." As Arthur worriedly mentioned the strict dress code, Ophelia caught her reflection in the dark window. She wouldn't wear armor to their war. She would wear the truth. Ophelia is about to step into the lion's den, armed only with her truth. If you are rooting for her to stand tall against the judgment, please type the number 8 in the comments to show you are standing with her. And if you haven't already, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Black Brilliance and turn on the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep bringing you stories that celebrate dignity and inner strength. Now, let's see what happens when she arrives at the hotel. The dress hanging on the back of the door was not a statement of poverty, but a quiet declaration of freedom, a simple black sheath that cost less than the floral arrangements at a Sterling party. Ophelia ran her hand down the fabric. It wasn't silk or satin. It was a practical, durable blend that she had bought off the rack at a department store 3 years ago. It was clean, it was modest, and most importantly, it was hers. She was just zipping it up when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from a number she didn't have saved, but the profile picture, a blindingly white smile and perfect blonde curls, gave it away instantly. Hi, Ophelia. It's Tiffany. I know family events can be super intense, so I just wanted to send over a few links to some affordable dress rental shops nearby. My friends use them sometimes, just so you don't feel out of place or underdressed next to everyone else. Can't wait to meet you. Below the message was a string of links to high-end rental boutiques where a single night's rental cost more than Arthur's monthly grocery bill. Ophelia stared at the screen. The malice was wrapped in so much artificial sweetener it was almost impressive. So I don't feel out of place, she whispered to the empty room, a dry chuckle escaping her lips. She didn't type a reply. She simply put the phone away, smoothed down her black dress, and looked in the mirror. She saw a woman who didn't need costumes to know her worth. When Arthur arrived to pick her up, he was pacing by his car, a vintage beige Volvo that he had lovingly maintained for 30 years. It was a safe, sturdy car, much like the man himself, but tonight he looked like he was about to drive into a war zone. You look lovely, he said, though his eyes darted nervously to her bare neck, likely noting the absence of pearls or diamonds. Did you get a message from Tiffany? I did, Ophelia said calmly, sliding into the passenger seat. The leather was cracked and soft, smelling of old tobacco and comfort. She was very helpful. Arthur sighed, starting the engine. I'm sorry. She thinks she's being helpful, but she has the empathy of a barracuda. The drive to the Grand Sterling Hotel was quiet. Ophelia held Arthur's hand across the center console, her thumb tracing the back of his knuckles to stop them from whitening on the gear stick. As they pulled into the hotel's semicircular driveway, the contrast was immediate and jarring. They were sandwiched between a sleek black limousine and a roar of a sports car that looked like a spaceship. When Arthur pulled the old Volvo up to the valet stand, the young attendant looked at the car with open disdain, hesitating before he reluctantly opened Ophelia's door. The wind off the Boston Harbor was biting, whipping Ophelia's hair as she stepped onto the red carpet. The doorman, a man in a uniform that cost more than her outfit, looked past her initially, perhaps assuming she was staff using the wrong entrance. When he saw Arthur, his expression flickered into recognition, but his eyes lingered on Ophelia with a cold, assessing stare. They walked through the revolving doors, and the noise of the city vanished, replaced by the polite, murmuring hum of extreme wealth. The lobby was a cavern of marble and gold, lit by chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears. As they stepped onto the plush carpet, Ophelia felt the shift in the air. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. She felt the audit Arthur had warned her about, gazes sweeping from her sensible shoes to her unadorned neck, pricing her out in a matter of seconds. She stood tall, her chin lifted, refusing to shrink under the weight of their judgment. From across the marble floor, a figure draped in white lace and diamonds detached herself from the crowd and glided toward them. Tiffany had arrived, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. In the Sterling world, a compliment was never just a compliment. It was a polite, social way to remind you that you were trespassing. Tiffany stopped in front of them, a vision of white lace and aggressive perfection. She didn't hug Ophelia. Instead, she offered a limp hand and leaned back slightly, as if afraid that poverty might be contagious. Ophelia, you made it, Tiffany chirped, her voice carrying easily over the soft strains of the string quartet. Her eyes did a slow, deliberate crawl down the black sheath dress. And look at you. That dress is so minimalist. It's very brave to go so simple for a black tie event. I wish I had that kind of confidence. A ripple of giggles came from the cluster of bridesmaids behind her. Before Ophelia could respond, the crowd parted like the Red Sea for an elderly woman with steel-gray hair coiffed into an immovable helmet. Margaret Sterling walked with a cane that looked less like a walking aid and more like a scepter. She stopped before her son, ignoring Ophelia entirely. Arthur, she said, her tone clipped. Then, she slowly turned her gaze to Ophelia. And this must be the friend. Her skin is quite distinctive, isn't it? And no pearls, Arthur? I suppose not everyone understands the traditions of a formal evening. Arthur's jaw tightened, his face flushing a deep red. Mother, this is Ophelia. And she looks beautiful. Margaret sniffed, dismissing the comment. Just then, an elderly African-American waiter moved through the group with a tray of champagne flutes. His name tag read Mr. Henderson, and his hands were trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable shake. As he turned to offer a glass to Tiffany, a spasm hit his wrist. A single drop of champagne splashed onto the marble floor, inches from Tiffany's hem. "You clumsy idiot!" Tiffany shrieked, jumping back as if he had thrown acid. "Watch where you're going. You almost ruined a $10,000 dress." The chatter in the room died instantly. Mr. Henderson froze, his face crumbling in mortification. I am so sorry, Mississippi. My hand, I don't care about your hand." Tiffany snapped. "Get out of my sight." While the other guests looked at their shoes or sipped their drinks, pretending not to see the humiliation of an old man, Ophelia moved. She stepped forward, placing a gentle, steadying hand on Mr. Henderson's shaking arm. She took a napkin from her clutch and wiped the spot on the floor herself. "It was just a drop, sir," Ophelia said, her voice low and warm, audible only to him and the silent circle around them. "Accidents happen. You are doing a wonderful job." She looked him in the eye, smiling with genuine warmth. "Thank you for your service." Mr. Henderson looked at her, his eyes wet with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered, straightening his back before retreating to the kitchen. Arthur watched her, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it hurt. But Margaret was apoplectic. She grabbed Arthur's elbow, pulling him a step away. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, though her stage whisper was meant to carry. "Bringing her here was bad enough, but now she's fraternizing with the help? It's embarrassing, Arthur. She clearly doesn't belong in polite society." Arthur opened his mouth to defend her, but his stutter returned under his mother's glare. "As she is kind." Ophelia stepped in, cutting off his struggle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her temper. She stood tall, radiating a calm authority that made Margaret seem small despite her diamonds. "Mrs. Sterling," Ophelia said softly, "polite society is easy to buy. Manners, however, cannot be purchased. I would rather stand with a clumsy waiter who has a good heart than with a queen who has none." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had never been spoken to like that in her life. Margaret turned her back on them, a signal of social execution, while the heavy doors swung open for the ceremony, and Ophelia sensed the real trial was just beginning. The wedding march swelled through the gilded hall, but the groom at the altar looked less like a man in love and more like a man waiting for a firing squad. David Thorne stood stiffly in his tuxedo, sweat beading on his forehead despite the climate-controlled air. While the guests craned their necks to admire the flower arrangements and the gold-leaf ceiling, an usher with a tight, apologetic smile had led Ophelia and Arthur to their seats. They were not in the front rows with the family, nor in the middle with the friends. They were placed in the very last row of folding chairs, right next to the swinging doors of the service kitchen. It was a final, petty banishment designed to make them invisible. Arthur sat with his arms crossed, his knuckles white. "I should have made a scene," he muttered. "I shouldn't have let them put us here." "Hush," Ophelia said gently, smoothing her skirt. "The view is the same from here as it is from the front. We are here to witness, Arthur. Let's just witness." The ceremony began. The officiant started speaking about love and partnership, but David wasn't listening. His eyes were restless, darting back and forth across the sea of faces. He looked like a man searching for a lifeline. He scanned the front row, the middle section, his gaze growing more frantic with every passing second. Tiffany, standing beside him, nudged his arm discreetly, flashing a perfect smile for the photographer, but David ignored her. His search moved to the back of the room. His eyes swept over the distant cousins and the business associates until they landed on the shadowed corner near the kitchen doors. He blinked. He squinted, leaning forward slightly as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman in the simple black dress sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with a familiar, steady gaze. David's breath hitched. He took a step back, nearly tripping over the altar step. "Stop," he said. It wasn't a shout, but in the acoustically perfect room, it sounded like a gunshot. The officiant froze mid-sentence. The string quartet trailed off into a discordant squeak. "David," Tiffany hissed, her smile faltering. "What are you doing?" David didn't answer. He stepped down from the raised platform. He walked past his bride, past his parents, and began to march down the long, red-carpeted center aisle. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Guests turned in their seats, whispering furiously. Tiffany's face twisted into a mask of confusion and then triumph. "Security," she whispered to her maid of honor, loud enough for half the room to hear. "He's finally going to kick that woman out." The room held its breath, anticipating a scandal. They watched the groom storm toward the back of the room, his stride purposeful. Arthur stood up halfway, ready to defend Ophelia physically if necessary. "David, listen to me," Arthur started, stepping in front of her. David didn't even see Arthur. He gently moved him aside and stopped directly in front of Ophelia. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had turned to solid glass. David looked at the woman the Sterling family had spent the entire evening mocking. He saw the cheap dress. He saw the calm dignity. And then, he did the unthinkable. He bowed. It wasn't a nod. It was a deep, formal bow of profound respect and gratitude. When he straightened up, there were tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling, loud enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you knew my wife." The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, suffocating, and sharp with the shattering of 1,000 assumptions. A reputation takes a lifetime to build, but in the Sterling ballroom, prejudices were dismantled in under 60 seconds. The silence was broken only by David's heavy breathing as he stood before Ophelia, looking at her as if she were a deity who had descended to walk among mortals. He turned to the bewildered crowd, to his new wife who stood frozen at the altar with her mouth agape, and then back to Ophelia. "You all look confused," David said, his voice gaining strength, ringing with a fierce protective pride. "You see a woman in a simple dress and you think she doesn't belong here. But let me tell you who this is." He gestured to Ophelia, who remained seated, her expression unreadable. "This is Ophelia Vance, the founder and CEO of Vance Capital." The name hit the room like a physical shockwave. A low murmur started at the front and swept to the back like wildfire. Vance Capital. The name was legendary in financial circles, a quiet, private fund known for making kings and breaking empires. And the woman sitting next to the kitchen doors was its architect. 5 years ago, David continued, tears spilling onto his cheeks now, when every bank in this city laughed at my startup, when my own investors pulled out and I was days away from bankruptcy, she was the only one who took a meeting with me. She didn't ask about my pedigree. She didn't ask who my father was. She listened to my idea. She wrote a check that saved my life, and she never asked for anything in return other than hard work. He looked at Tiffany, his eyes hardening. Every dollar that paid for this wedding, for that dress, for this hotel, it exists because Ophelia Vance believed in me. The realization settled over the room with crushing weight. The guests who had sneered at her shoes, the valet who had mocked the car, and the family who had tried to hide her, they were all suddenly stripped naked in the harsh light of truth. They hadn't just insulted a guest, they had insulted the most powerful person in the room. Panic, sharp and immediate, flashed across Margaret Sterling's face. Her social survival instincts kicked in, overriding her shame. She hurried toward them, her cane clicking frantically on the marble floor, her face contorted into a grotesque mask of welcoming warmth. Tiffany was right behind her, her anger replaced by a desperate, fawning terror. "Oh, Ophelia!" Margaret cried out, reaching out as if to embrace a long-lost daughter. "My dear, why didn't you say something? This is all just a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. We simply didn't know who you were. We were just trying to help you fit in," Tiffany added, her voice trembling with a fake sweetness that was nauseating. "Please come to the front row. We have a seat for you. We insist." Ophelia stood up slowly. She didn't look at David or the crowd. She looked directly at Margaret, whose outstretched hand hovered in the air, ignored. Ophelia's gaze was calm, but it held the weight of an entire lifetime of being judged. "It was not a misunderstanding, Mrs. Sterling," Ophelia said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. You knew exactly who you were talking to. You were talking to a guest in your home. The fact that you need a bank account balance to treat someone with basic dignity says nothing about me and everything about you. She paused, letting the words sink in. You weren't rude to Vance Capital, Margaret. You were rude to a human being. She turned to Arthur, who was looking at her with a mixture of shock and overwhelming pride. Arthur, she said softly, I believe we've stayed long enough. Arthur nodded, standing tall. He offered her his arm, not as a shield this time, but as a partner. They stepped into the aisle, and the crowd parted instinctively, terrified to meet Ophelia's eyes. They walked past the groom who owed her everything, past the bride who had offered her a rental dress, and past the matriarch who was now trembling not with rage, but with humiliation. As they walked away, leaving the bride in tears and the matriarch in shock, Ophelia didn't look back. Queens never do when they leave a peasant's court. The autumn wind outside the hotel bit at their cheeks, but after the suffocating pretense inside, the cold felt like a cleansing baptism. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Sterling swung shut behind them, sealing away the murmur of scandals and the glitter of false diamonds. Arthur opened the passenger door of his beige Volvo with the same care he always did, his hands steady now, though his mind was clearly reeling. They drove in silence for a long time. The city lights of Boston streaked across the windshield like shooting stars, blurring into ribbons of gold and red. Inside the car, the smell of old leather and faint tobacco was a comfort, a return to the reality they had built together. It was a small, safe world, far removed from the empire Ophelia ran and the high society Arthur had just abandoned. Finally, Arthur cleared his throat. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel was loose, resigned. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice raspy. And not because I didn't know who you were. I don't care about the money, Ophelia. I never have. He paused at a red light and turned to look at her, his expression filled with a deep, aching regret. I'm sorry because I was arrogant. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was bringing a fragile flower into a storm, and I tried to shield you with my own hands. I didn't realize I was walking beside a lioness. I failed to see your strength because I was too busy worrying about their judgment. Ophelia reached out and covered his hand on the gearshift. The leather was worn smooth under her palm. I didn't hide it to test you, Arthur, she said softly, the streetlights casting shadows across her face. I hid it because I was tired. In my world, everyone wants something. They want the checkbook, the influence, the connection. When I met you in that bookstore, you didn't look at my portfolio. You looked at my book. You argued with me about philosophy. You saw me. She squeezed his hand. I just wanted to keep that sanctuary safe for a little while longer. I wanted to know that someone loved the woman in the gray sweater, not the woman on the Forbes list. Arthur let out a laugh, a short, wet sound that was half sob. He pulled the car over suddenly, the tires crunching on the gravel of a roadside lot. Above them, a flickering neon sign buzzed. The Bluebell Diner. It wasn't a five-star restaurant. It smelled of frying onions and strong, cheap coffee. It was perfect. He turned off the engine and turned to her fully. Ophelia, he said, his voice steady and sure. I fell in love with the woman who drinks her coffee black and reads in the dark. The fact that you can buy this city doesn't change who you are to me. It just means I'll have to try harder to beat you at chess. He smiled, the anxiety finally leaving his eyes, replaced by a warmth that outshone any chandelier in the Sterling ballroom. Now, I believe I promised you dinner. And since I'm currently unemployed by my family, it might have to be something modest. He winked. Let me buy you a burger, boss. They sat in a vinyl booth near the window, eating greasy cheeseburgers and sharing a basket of fries. They laughed, their shoulders touching, surrounded by truckers and night shift workers who had no idea they were sitting next to a titan of industry. There were no pearls, no tuxedos, and no expectations. Just two people who had weathered a storm and come out the other side holding hands. In a world obsessed with price tags, they had found the only thing that was truly priceless. As the artificial glitz of the ballroom faded behind them, Ophelia and Arthur reminded us that true nobility is found not in titles or pearls, but in the quiet courage to be oneself. Their journey is a gentle testament that while money can buy a place at the table, only dignity can command the room. If Ophelia's strength warmed your spirit today, please consider sharing this story with a friend who needs a reminder of their own worth. And for more tales that celebrate the unshakable power of the human soul, we warmly invite you to subscribe to Black Brilliance, because here, inner light is the only gold that matters.